We continue to reflect on the bread of life in the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus has just told the crowds that he is the living bread that's come down from heaven. They're having trouble with that. They got the human Jesus. We know his mother and his father. They grasped that part. They can't wrap their mind around the other part, that his origin could be from God, that he could come from heaven. In the Gospel of John, in the very first chapter, we know that the Word became flesh. Literally, the Word put skin on and dwelt among us. They can't put together that Jesus could be the connection between heaven and earth. They can only see the earth part. And so they are complaining about Jesus. In that sense, they are like the Israelites in the wilderness, as we heard last Sunday, barely 2 verses out of Egypt, and already they are united in their complaining against Moses. They said, "Have you brought us out of Egypt to die here in the wilderness?" And then God sent this bread they had never seen, this manna from heaven, this gift that continued to feed them for the 40 years they journeyed through the wilderness. So we hear this story picked up today with the prophet Elijah. Elijah has provoked, really, the wrath of Queen Jezebel. Now, if you know Jezebel, it's not too hard to provoke her, and she's pretty ruthless. But truth to tell, Elijah is not totally innocent. However, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to tell him that he would be put to death. And so Elijah now is running into the wilderness. He's gone only a single day into the wilderness, and suddenly he cries out to God, "Take my life." Elijah feels like the Israelites who have just come out of Egypt and entered into the wilderness. I'm going to die here. And so Elijah, in the desert, lays down under a solitary broom tree, and he cries out, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life. I'm just like my ancestors when they got into the wilderness and could not see any possibility of going forward. It felt as if they had exhausted everything. They'd come to the end of their rope." We heard a similar story a few weeks ago in the Gospel of Mark. A woman had been suffering from internal bleeding for many years. During those years, she tried everything within her power to come to healing, and nothing worked. In fact, she actually had gotten worse. She was fatigued and discouraged. Finally, with all of her resources spent and all that was humanly in view exhausted, she decided that she would sneak up and touch Jesus. As she touched him, she felt a power flow from her. She became whole. Something from beyond herself, something beyond ordinary possibility, now flowed where formerly she hemorrhaged. So just as the woman touches Jesus, so the messenger touches Elijah and tells him to eat and drink. In our translation, the messenger is translated as angel, but it's probably better to translate it as a messenger. Just like Jezebel sent a messenger to tell Elijah that he was going to die, so the Lord God sends a messenger to Elijah with a message of life. And with food, bread and water, the 2 essentials for survival in the harsh wilderness. Elijah gets up and eats and drinks, and then he falls asleep again. He's not yet recovered from his depression. And so once again, the messenger touches Elijah and urges him to drink and eat, but this time providing a reason, or the journey will be too much for you. We all know that experience when the journey is too much for us. We live constantly at the limits of our own capacities, where our words fail us, where our resources are not enough, and where we feel acutely our dullness, our failure, our moral impotence, our bitterness and distance from God and others. We are constantly helpless to heal and helpless to celebrate. In that fatigue and tension, we need to abandon ourselves into God's embrace. Father Ron Rolheiser, who was with us this past week, says that the Eucharist is God physically embracing us. In the Eucharist, we touch Christ and are held to his heart. All sacraments are God's physical embrace. Words have a relative power, but in critical situations they often fail us. And when this happens, we have another language, the language of ritual, the language of touch. G.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic apologist, had a wonderful description of this experience. He said, there comes a time, usually late in the afternoon, when the little child tires of playing policeman and robber, and it's then the child begins to torment the cat. He said, mothers with young children are only too familiar with this late afternoon hour and its particular dynamic. There comes this hour, usually just before supper, when a child's energy is low, when the child is tired and whining, and when the mother has exhausted both her patience and her repertoire of warnings. Leave that alone. Don't do that. The child, tense and miserable, is clinging to her leg. At that point, the mother knows what to do. She picks up the child. Touch, not word, is what is needed. In her arms, the child grows calm, and tension leaves the body. The Eucharist is God's kiss. André Dubose, the Cajun novelist, used to say, without the Eucharist, God becomes a monologue. We are that tense, overwrought child perennially tormenting the cat. There comes a point, even with God, when words aren't enough, when God has to pick us up like a mother her child. Physical embrace is what's needed. Skin needs to be touched. It's why God took on flesh in Jesus and gives us the Eucharist.